A death metal listener needs to be able to put up with a lot of things to appreciate the genre. Inaudible vocals, constant migraines from distortion, their own rancid stench, but one thing they should definitely not be is confused. More specifically, confused about the differences between the subgenres and the music they enjoy so much for whatever reason. Different stylistic influences, conventions and styles of playing have led to a schizophrenic spiderweb of subgenres that have branched off from what is already essentially a subgenre, which can obviously lead to confusion. For example, deathcore, technical death metal, grindcore. What the f does it all actually mean? What's the difference? Why is there a difference? Why would you even choose to subject yourself to this music in the first place? Well, these are the questions I'm going to attempt to answer in this video, whilst also attacking your senses with disgustingly fast-paced editing and misinformation. That's a joke, YouTube. That is a joke. Before we dive into the more niche subgenres, I think it's best to define death metal as a subgenre on its own and briefly explore its history. So death metal is listed as one of the extreme subgenres of heavy metal, which explains why it attracts so many freaks and smelly individuals. Anybody who describes themselves as extreme or consumes something known as extreme either looks like this, partakes in this, or is just trying to compensate for something. A key element of the guitars within death metal is the low-tuned heavy distortion. The riffs need to sound akin to a broken piece of machinery. Guitarists within the genre also have an extremely high chance of developing arthritis due to the playing techniques employed. Palm muting is used, although that's kind of essential due to the amount of distortion layered on the guitars. Tremolo picking is also employed, which essentially means playing as fast as humanly possible and developing as much RSI as physically possible for a human being. I would touch on the bass guitar before delving deeper into the other instrumentation elements, but you will literally never be able to hear the bass underneath the wall of distortion and throat cancer that's assaulting your eardrums. So let's swiftly move on to the other instrumentation before we begrudgingly touch on vocals. Drums are incredibly fast-paced and aggressive, with each death metal drummer either looking like this or this. Drummers will utilise techniques such as blast beats, double kick, essentially anything that will fill the mix with as much noise as humanly possible. Occasionally bands will utilise other instruments such as electronic keyboards or synths, but again you can barely f***ing hear it due to the absolute catastrophic mess that is the mix. Let's move on to vocals. Essentially imagine the last noise an 106-year-old would make before he kicks the bucket. Imagine that sound was elongated and came from the throat of a skinny kid with long greasy hair. That is essentially death metal vocals. So now we're aware of the typical formula for the overarching genre, let's move on to some of the more specific subgenres, starting with of course the first, and some would say the most iconic, old school death metal. For the most part I covered this genre and its history in my ignorant guide, so I'll just skim over it quickly. The genre was birthed when Possessed would combine their Venom, Slayer and Motorhead influences to create what would eventually be known as death metal. They would combine fast-paced tremolo picking, blast beats and raspy vocals, differentiating themselves enough from the contemporaries, allowing them to be considered another genre. Another band that would be extremely influential is Death, who has by far the most creative name within the genre. The characteristics of old school death metal were essentially acknowledged during the first paragraph, so if you missed it, make sure to watch this video again and give me more views and ad revenue. Let's move on to technical death metal, also known as tech death. Tech death began to develop during the early to mid 90s when death metal musicians realised they had wasted their entire life thus far practicing their instruments, so decided to make their music as technical and intricate as humanly possible, only for future fans to flex their 100% completion rate on Rocksmith. Key features of the genre include dynamic song structures, schizophrenic rhythms that consistently change throughout the song, overuse of diminished and arpeggiated chords, essentially just any element or technique that is seen as impressive for other musicians or people who look like this, but are completely uninteresting for the severe lack of bitches you have. Bass and drum follow the same formula here, with bass lines sometimes being more akin to jazz fusion genres, so basically funky as f***. It's a shame you can't hear it because the singer needs to show off the fact that he has permanent lung damage from smoking too many cigarettes. Bands within tech death include Death, Pestilence, Atheist and Cynic. Another genre that's very similar to tech death in the fact that it was just created to flex skill is progressive death metal. Whilst tech death is more focused on virtuosity and speed, progressive death metal aims to combine more genres and influences into the death metal formula, focusing on experimentation and atmosphere as opposed to... The genre essentially merges the chaos of progressive music with the aggression and distortion of death metal. The first band to combine these two things would be Amorphis, combining death metal with 70s progressive rock and Finnish folk music, creating something that is as chaotic as it sounds. Death would even start venturing into the more progressive side of the genre when they recruited some of the members of Cynic in the early 90s. A band that is consistently seen as being at the top of the mountain of progressive death metal is Opeth. creating some extremely long songs, because of course a song can't be progressive unless it's at least 10 minutes long. Let's move on to something that's less nerdy and a little bit more brutal, well, literally brutal. Brutal death metal focuses completely on the heaviness of the music, rather than focusing on melodies or song structure or raw solos, or really anything that would actually sound appealing. They focus on distortion, heaviness, speed and complex rhythms. Whilst we're on the topic of something that's entirely unappealing, the album art is pretty consistently absolutely vile within this subgenre. This has actually led to controversy, with some artists being banned from certain countries. This subgenre would begin to blossom. Actually, I don't think blossom is the right term, to be honest. This subgenre would begin to tear through skin and bone, with Suffocation's 1991 album, Effigy of the Forgotten. The band essentially ripped out any influence of thrash metal, creating something absolutely vile. Other bands such as Cannibal Corpse will begin to push this formula to its limit, with the vocals essentially becoming more gross and inaudible. It's essentially gotten to the point where a brutal death metal band doesn't even need to write lyrics anymore. It wouldn't make a difference. Other bands worth checking out are Cattle Decapitation, Aborted and Cryptopsy. Since we're on the topic of the absolute degeneracy within this subgenre, let's swiftly move on to grindcore and its subsequent subgenres. Obviously I've made a guide to this as well, so I'll keep it short and sweet, just like grindcore. Although grindcore isn't entirely connected to death metal, it's kind of its own thing, I do believe it spawned from the genre, so f*** it. Grindcore essentially was the result of hardcore punk bands being inspired by the more extreme side of metal music, in turn making their music more extreme, and most importantly, shorter. When bands began to specifically become more interested in death metal, this resulted in death grind, and when grindcore bands began to become somehow more degenerate, this led to gore grind and no grind. Let's quickly speedrun the last few, as a lot of them are incredibly niche and easy to explain. Then you can stop procrastinating and get back to whatever the f you do normally. Slam metal is a version of brutal death metal that focuses more so on the rhythmic aspect, specifically with grooves and breakdowns. This then went even further with deathcore that became even more breakdown heavy and added some metalcore elements into the mix, such as growled vocals and high-pitched shrieks. Blackened death metal is essentially death metal that incorporates the musical, lyrical or ideological elements of black metal, so essentially even more tremolo picking, guitar with more treble, somehow more distortion and extremely questionable political opinions. A micro-genre that spans from this is blackened death doom, which is essentially the same thing, just super slow. And as if black metal and death metal hadn't been combined enough, there's melodic black death, which spawned when melodic death metal bands, which is essentially death metal with a focus on melody as opposed to became more so inspired by black metal. Of course, death metal would also clash heads with doom metal, leading to death doom and funeral doom. The former just incorporated the vocals and drums of death metal with the slow tempos and pessimistic attitude of doom metal, and the latter is even slower and even more depressing. Death and Roll combines the riff and playing style of 1970s rock music with the vocals and guitar tone of death metal, boomer death metal if you will. Death thrash is, you guessed it, a combination of death metal and thrash metal, which usually just ends up sounding like one or the other, but of course it needs to be categorized into a different subgenre to make my life even more difficult. And finally, symphonic death metal, which is again pretty f***ing obvious, but hey, you clicked on this video, what do you expect? I'm essentially just spoon feeding you obvious information at this point. Symphonic death metal essentially just combines death metal with classical music, but of course not too much, because that would actually make it sound good. So there we go, now you're fully aware of each of the main subgenres of death metal. Make sure you keep this information close to your heart for when you will never be asked about it, because you don't leave your room or speak to people who aren't already obsessed with this abhorrent genre of music. You can tell I'm writing this video late at night because of how eternally fucking vexed I seem.